Hey, welcome back. This would be, I guess, now week 7, I guess. This is week 7, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, PAS. Those are different things, of course. Euthanasia in general, when we're talking about that, we mean that the decisive thing that might bring about a patient's life is brought about by the physician or the doctor or some medical professional, either in the active sense of doing something directly or the passive sense of, say, withdrawing or cutting off some life-preserving measure. Whereas physician-assisted suicide is understood to be where the physician or whoever might supply something necessary for the patient, him or herself, to end her life. Usually that's the form of supplying some sort of lethal narcotic, say. For our purposes, we're not going to distinguish them so much all the time. Generally speaking, the moral issues are quite proximate in all of those kinds of cases, basically. So the distinction will come up, and of course it's good to know, but it's not actually always going to be central. Most of the ethical issues apply similarly in all those cases. So we have, I think, 6 items on our reading list for this week, basically. So the first, as usual, is just the Vaughan material from the text, which is, you're pretty straightforward, pretty easy reading, I think, relatively speaking. Quite useful generally in terms of the main ideas, the distinctions there, so especially between what I've just mentioned, active and passive senses of euthanasia, but also the senses of those being voluntary or non-voluntary. Voluntary is fairly straightforward. The non-voluntary is basically where there is the lack of that explicit kind of consent, further to be contrasted with involuntary cases, which don't usually come up in moral or ethical discussion just because virtually everybody writes them off as obviously impermissible, so I'm not going to worry about that. But sort of non-voluntary cases might have to do sometimes with advance directives, or where there may be ambiguities in those, or basically generally cases where someone there's a surrogate form of autonomy, whether it's in the families or others connected to the patient. So those are the kinds of distinctions and so on that are very useful, terminology that's quite important. There's other things in the chapter, brief discussions of some of the legal landmarks, in particular in the American context, and numerous references to the situation in the Netherlands, where, as you may know, euthanasia has been legalized for longer than anywhere else. And there's a section on the Nancy Crezan case and some references to other cases as well. All of that makes for good reading. Prepares you well to read the other things that we have on our list. Just one other thing I'll note there, it does come up. There's a couple of main things, some main themes that will go through these texts. So one of them Vaughan touches on as well. And that's just the idea about the meaning of death. So not just in the sense of, say, questions about what is death, is it brain death or higher brain death? That's important too. But just the sense of whether death is a harm. Normally we think it is, and in most cases, of course, it is. But in the cases of euthanasia, that is exactly what changes. So even though in core cases of, say, active euthanasia, it's perfectly appropriate to say that a doctor, for example, kills somebody, that is what goes on in the sense of actively causing somebody's death. That's not murder, right? So the sense is that killing isn't supposed to already be a kind of normatively loaded term. Killing's a fact, and then we need to ethically judge whether it was justified or not, or whether somebody is guilty or culpable in some way or other. Generally speaking, proponents of active euthanasia would say, no, in this case, killing is not wrong. Basically. So anyway, that's something that will come up. Basically, we just don't want to be led astray or get confused when we're ever speaking or thinking that, well, clearly this is a case of killing and therefore must be wrong. That's where we need to go more slowly when we're talking about euthanasia. That point is, of course, quite central to the Rachel's piece. It's fairly short. It's just a discussion basically to the effect that how we usually might be inclined to think or assume that killing somebody is different from letting them die, so there's a active versus a passive sense here, that distinction, which lots of people sometimes try to bring into the context of euthanasia, typically to show that something is indeed wrong, doesn't hold up. That's Rachel's point. It really does not hold up that there's any morally significant difference between killing and letting die. So that just means that killing is not necessarily worse, morally speaking, than letting die. And conversely, letting die is not necessarily any less bad than killing. It all depends on the context and other factors that have to be taken into account. So this isn't directly saying yes or no to the permissibility of euthanasia or anything, but just kind of clarifying a very important point that will come up. And indeed, it comes up then in the Brock piece, a little bit longer, just basically just a defense of the permissibility of active voluntary euthanasia. And a big part of that, as you'll see, it rests upon sort of that breaking down that distinction between killing and letting die, and just seeing that a lot of the objections to active voluntary euthanasia depend upon the salience of that distinction. So when we lose that, it just sort of forces us to look more closely at the particular cases in order to form a judgment. So here, Brock is basically saying, I think, and others will say something in effect that amounts to the same thing. That is to say that, there are some fairly easy cases, basically. So let's just kind of focus on active voluntary cases. There can be some relatively easy cases. That is, where we're dealing with a patient who's clearly competent, exercising autonomy, has some sort of condition for which there is no cure, which is causing great suffering, and the prognosis is not for any long life afterwards anyways. It's in circumstances like that where you have that set of conditions that it seems pretty hard to argue against. It almost seems cruel, to deny that person their right to die in the way that they wish. And so a big part of Brock's argument is directed against what we'll just call the slippery slope argument, or slippery slope style arguments against euthanasia. So what's really important about these usually is that, anyway, you can make a kind of slippery slope argument against euthanasia, and that doesn't mean that you are directly saying that euthanasia is wrong. So the Arras article would be a case in point here. You don't have to think euthanasia itself is wrong. In general, if you make a slippery slope argument against something, it's not because that is wrong. If you just think it's wrong, and you would just make a direct argument that asserts that it's wrong, and you'd be done. But a slippery slope argument says, well, it may be okay, but the problem is it will lead to larger problems which are wrong, basically. So that's the point. So Brock is addressing some of those. He basically says, I don't think they actually amount to too much. Doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evidence. You'll see the kinds of things he says there that substantiate the worries people may have. And what's more, typically most of those worries aren't about, euthanasia per se. There's something else. So, for example, if someone thinks there's a slippery slope, there's a worry that allowing for voluntary euthanasia could somehow lead to more instances of non-voluntary euthanasia, possibly even involuntary euthanasia. Brock is someone who will say, well, that's just a problem with how we deal with autonomy, how we deal with advanced directives, how we deal with surrogate forms of autonomy, and so on, not with the ethical permissibility of euthanasia as such. When we turn to the Callahan piece, now that's a more sort of, definitely anti-euthanasia argument. It's an argument against the permissibility of euthanasia. He gives a bunch of different reasons, and to be, kind of honest, it's something that sometimes I would describe as like a plate-throwing kind of argument. It's sort of, if you imagine old horror movies where there's like a creature chasing you, and you're running through your house, and all you do is just pick up whatever's at hand, and you just heave it at the monster trying to stop it, and it's like plates are being thrown, basically. He kind of does that. There's a bunch of different reasons he gives none of them are all that strong, just objectively considered, except the strongest one, and he does focus a lot on this, is indeed the slippery slope argument. Now, he thinks there's a lot more evidence in favor of that, so he really kind of pushes harder on that. And just to be fair, I mean, the argument, it's not a bad one. I mean, the worries are real. The problem is that when you have those seemingly easy core cases of active, say, voluntary euthanasia, where you have all those conditions met, we can say maybe that's okay, but if we're not perfectly clear as to what exactly is making it okay, then there can be a worries, right? You can lose one of those conditions, and then people will wonder, well, okay, here's an autonomous person and a competent person, rather. They're not exactly in pain, but all the other conditions are met. Why would we deny them the same thing? Or someone else who perhaps has a long time to live, or just any of the other conditions that may not be satisfied. It's not clear. And that way it can just spread and grow, and in particular in the direction, well, if somebody is not competent to decide, it becomes increasingly likely that if all the other conditions are met, that people might be inclined to think, well, actually, perhaps euthanasia is appropriate and permissible here too. That it becomes more the idea that the right to die in a certain way somehow morphs into a duty to die, or that someone might even be obliged, in a sense, to have their life ended or to end their life. That's kind of the worry that we'll see in the last couple of pieces, the one from Arras and the very short one from Carr, basically. They're both kind of similar. I don't sense in either of them that there's the same kind of inherent opposition to euthanasia as you might find or supposed to be there in Callahan, but they oppose it nonetheless on slippery slope grounds. So Carr very specifically in terms of its possible consequences for disabled people, thinking that in their cases, right, where they perhaps already feel a very unfair burden, you might say, of proof. I shouldn't say burden of proof, but their experience as being a burden in some way, and that somehow it would just be easier or make more sense for them to think that they should opt for euthanasia in a very unfair, kind of biased way. That's the way this kind of right somehow starts to transform into a duty that's really quite unfair and unjust. So that's basically what Arras is saying as well, I think, in a more general sense, and it can apply in different sorts of ways to different vulnerable groups, basically, where there might just emerge this unfair, disproportionate pressure to actually exercise this option. It is supposed to be an option, but somehow it becomes a bit more of a duty in some way. So you can be, as Arras is, sympathetic to the permissibility of euthanasia in the kinds of, core cases where we usually think about it, and yet nonetheless think that it should not be legalized or permitted, at least not yet, until other situations are altered. So when you think about Carr, just sort of the perception and the place in society of disabled people. For Arras, he thinks, well, there's just injustices and unfairness and all kinds of structural problems in the healthcare system, which can lead to kind of put people in those kinds of conditions, perhaps, which perhaps they shouldn't be, on an unfair basis. Certain lines of unfairness and discrimination and inequalities can start to kind of show up, even with regard to issues concerning euthanasia. So just seems to be a lot of things he thinks that ought to be taken care of first, so that we can perhaps have much better health care for everyone, especially at the end of life, wherever that may come for somebody, so that nobody feels kind of pushed in an unfair way to make, a certain kind of decision about ending their life. So it may be all well and good for people, in general, to have the right to make such decisions, but if it's the case that certain groups are sort of unfairly, expected to answer that question or to make that decision in a certain way, then something's messed up. Anyway, I got to wrap this up. It looks like we're running out of time, so there'll be a quiz on this, I think, by the end of reading, spring break, whatever. It's in a couple of weeks, the 15th, I think. So we have this week, then there's a break, so there's no new material. And then we'll see you again after the break.